I'm really excited to introduce my colleague and friend Luke Harding, who's here from Lancaster University. He is senior lecturer in the Department of Linguistics and English Language at Lancaster, and I in fact have visited that university twice. It's for those of you who are considering, my undergrads who are considering graduate programs outside of Georgetown, you should definitely think about it. His research interests are mainly in the area of language assessment. So we spend a lot of time at conferences here and abroad together. And he's published in areas of listening assessment, pronunciation assessment, language assessment literacy, which for those of you who aren't in the field, that's what people understand about language assessment and how they interpret it correctly or incorrectly, diagnostic language assessment, and the challenge of English as a lingua franca for language assessment. This ELF talk is not on Elvish, but rather on English as a lingua franca. So Luke's work has appeared in, come on in, there's still a couple pieces of pizza left, in all kinds of journals, including Language Testing, Language Assessment Quarterly, Applied Linguistics, and Language Teaching. He's the author of a book, Accent and Listening Assessment, which my undergraduates will tell you is in all of their dentist offices, and is currently co-editor of the journal Language Testing. Now, how he's still standing with all this is beyond me. And a lot of his work focuses on intelligibility and listening, which we all know from about a third of the people here in my undergrad class on how languages are learned. And so we're really looking forward to hearing this, and we will have time at the end for questions, but if you have something burning, you can ask him, but I will facilitate questions at the end. Okay, go.
Right, thank you, Meg. That was a very nice introduction. It's great to be here in Georgetown. This is my first time in Washington, D.C., so I'm having a really interesting time. And yeah, thanks for coming along. So, as Meg said, the topic of this talk is English as a lingua franca language assessment, and I am going to be using this abbreviation ELF, and yes, it means English as a lingua franca, so don't be distracted by that. So the outline of the talk today, I'm going to start off by talking about two challenges posed by English as a lingua franca. So I'm actually going to start by talking a little bit about English as a lingua franca, and then I'm going to talk about two challenges which ELF poses for language assessment and language testing. Now I know that some of you in the room are doing second language acquisition and are sort of interested in this topic from that perspective, so you might be able to make some connections there as well. I'm then going to talk about the response to English as a lingua franca which has come from the language assessment field, and then I'm going to go and kind of discuss some exploratory work I've been doing on defining an ELF construct that we can actually use to assess English as a lingua franca ability or competence, looking specifically at listening to an unfamiliar accent or developing what I call a purpose-built ELF task. And then I'm going to talk about some future research directions, which some of you might, if you're interested in the talk and thinking about doing further research in this area, you might find that part interesting. A lot of what I'm going to say today, particularly in the early sections, comes from a chapter from this book. So this book was released, I think just very early this year, the Routledge Handbook of English as a Lingua Franca. It's a really interesting collection. So if you're interested in some of the issues today, this is definitely one to take a look at. And the chapter that I wrote in that book was co-authored with Tim McNamara, who some of you might be familiar with from his work in language testing. So, to get started, what is ELF? Some of you will probably have a pretty good understanding of ELF already, but a good definition I think to start with is the one provided by Barbara Seidelhofer, which is that English as a lingua franca is communication in English between speakers with different first languages. So this can include, L2 users speaking with other L2 users, or what we would kind of traditionally call native speaker users communicating with L2 users, and so on. Now, ELF kind of emerged from this recognition that there's a great number of communicative situations taking place around the world which occur between non-native speakers of English. Okay, so there are these kind of figures that you regularly see English is now by 25% of the population to varying degrees, and there are more Elf conversations daily than conversations between native speakers. It's sometimes a bit hard to find out the kind of veracity of these statements, but I think it's a fairly good assumption that we have a kind of typical Elf situation of, say, a business person in Japan speaking on the telephone to another business person in Germany, and these kinds of communications are very common in a globalized world. Another paradigm which is closely related to Elf is World Englishes, and some of you will be familiar with this as well. I think it's important to establish early on that there's a distinction between a World Englishes paradigm and an Elf paradigm. World Englishes is typically associated with the concept of a nation, or at least a kind of geographic boundary around a language. So we speak of Indian English, Singapore English, Sri Lankan English, and so on. These are kind of World Englishes concepts. Elf is a little bit different to that, as I'll go on to demonstrate. It's less focused on describing a distinct variety, and it's more focused on describing a kind of communicative situation, to some extent an unpredictable communicative situation. So, Elf Research, if we look at its kind of Elf, if you like, to trying to understand what makes communication possible, what makes communication effective in these kinds of contexts which are by nature very fluid and very dynamic, okay? And this is the kind of typical Elf encounter is often transitory, there's not a lot of background knowledge about your interlocutor and so on. So what makes communication effective in these kinds of situations? And I think this is kind of well summed up by Suresh Kanagaraja. I'm sorry, that's a bit low down there. But what Kanagaraja says is Elf is intersubjectively constructed in each specific context of interaction, negotiated by each set of speakers for their purposes. So we can see here Elf is essentially characterized as dynamic, fluid, unpredictable, and requires a set of competences that can meet that kind of challenge. So what are these kind of competences that can meet that challenge? Well, some of the key elements of Elf communication that have been sort of revealed in the research literature are as follows. So the number one is really accommodation, okay? So accommodation in a linguistic sense is sort of linguistic coming together in some way, whether it's in modifying one's speech to be more intelligible, or in adjusting one's kind of attitudinal behavior to be able to kind of receive a message with a more kind of open mind. There's different ways in which accommodation is conceptualized, but in an Elf sense, I think we've seen accommodation framed as making oneself intelligible to an interlocutor, or adjusting to an interlocutor's speech style or accent. Okay, and accommodation is really crucial to English as a lingua franca. Other features which are also crucial to success in English as a lingua franca have been shown to be these strategies which either preempt or negotiate misunderstandings, kind of in situ. Okay, so things like clarification requests, right? Just saying, really? Or, huh? Yeah, it's really important. Self-repair, repetition, and I want you to hold on to the idea of repetition because we'll come back to that a little bit later. But repetition, and also paraphrasing, so essentially sort of repackaging your ideas to make them more easily understood. And then just the sense of discourse management, of maintaining a smooth interaction, so things like turn taking, and being able to kind of rapidly understand or rapidly negotiate the rules of turn taking in a specific situation, and using appropriate politeness strategies. Now, in Elf, politeness is a little bit tricky, because how do you negotiate what's polite in a particular kind of unpredictable situation? But people tend to do it reasonably well, and a lot of elf literature shows that in many contexts, elf interlocutors are quite agreement-oriented, okay? And we can talk about that a bit later as well. So these are some key elements of elf, okay? And these are some contexts in which these key elements of elf might be really important competences. So, you know, it's not very clear, but you can see on the top there, kind of academic group discussion. You can perhaps all conceptualize some of your academic discussions as elf encounters, okay? Particularly when you're meeting people for the first time. A common one in language testing context is aviation context. So, as many of you will know, English is the kind of official international language of aviation, and all pilots and air traffic controllers need to demonstrate a certain level of proficiency in English to be able to perform, or to be certified to perform their jobs. But what kind of English is important? These are really classic kind of elf encounters where you have people from lots of different language backgrounds all interacting with each other in very high stakes environments. And then, you know, health communication is another one. I think another high stakes environment where these kinds of competences may be extremely important. Now, we've looked at ELF and we've kind of established what it is. What does it mean for language assessment? Now, I think there are two different kind of challenges that ELF poses for language assessment, and they're quite similar, but they're distinct enough to be called two, I think. The first one is kind of what we might call the kind of classic challenge, which is that these native speaker norms should no longer be considered the standard in language assessments. Okay, so if we recognise that ELF is an important type of communicative kind of context, and that it's probably very important in these high stakes settings, then we should no longer be kind of constrained by testing against these native speaker norms. Now, this kind of challenge actually overlaps with a World Englishes based critique, which actually was raised in the early 90s. So around the time when World Englishes was a very kind of important topic, still is, of course, but around the time when a lot of people were first talking about it, the World Englishes critique that was levelled at language testing was how can you kind of assess against sort of British English variety or American English variety when, you know, we have these other speakers of other varieties taking these tests and so on. So there's an overlap there. It's relevant, it's particularly relevant, this critique, to discrete measures of correctness. So when we're thinking about language testing and assessment, we often differentiate between more discrete measures of testing, which may be useful for testing grammar or vocabulary or pronunciation, and of course more kind of communicative performance-based assessments. But this critique also extends to things like rubric development, rated training, selection of input texts for reading and listening, and so on. So let me give you an example of this kind of challenge and how it might kind of disrupt, if you like, language assessment practices. So this is from actually quite an old paper now, Lowenberg, 2002. This is an item taken from the TOEIC test. Okay, some of you might be familiar with the TOEIC test. It's a big test of English that's used a lot in Japan and Korea in particular. So this is the item, and you can see there are 3 parts of that sentence underlined, and you have to say what is the error. Okay? So maybe check with the person sitting next to you if you've got the same idea of what the error is.
It should be a singular. Yeah, I think it's
Okay.
like I don't like reject it.
Who Who wants to tell me? Is it on sale? No. The only? Is it this one? Yeah, okay. Why? Yeah, okay, so we've got an uncountable noun with a suffix s, okay, pluralizing it when it doesn't need to be pluralized, according to some standard varieties of English. Now, if you look at the ELF literature, which has sort of come out since 2002, we actually see that the pluralization of uncountable nouns with s suffix is quite common in ELF contexts. And in fact, I did a kind of a Google Scholar. This is, really rigorous research. I just typed equipments made into Google Scholar, and what do I get? You can't really see that, but it's over 6,000 hits, right? And different journals. And what was interesting here is obviously this seems to be a feature particularly of Indian Englishes, but also it seemed to be in different fields as well, so more sort of engineering type fields, or more, I guess, what we call in the UK STEM fields, technology and so on. So there could be something disciplinary there going on as well. So this is just an example of how that kind of critique actually is a very valid critique of maybe some of the older testing practices. Okay, and it should be said that actually a lot of tests don't test grammar in this discrete way anymore. We often test grammar through more kind of performance-based assessments of extended writing and speaking. But anyway, okay. The second challenge actually kind of extends and elaborates on that first one. And the second challenge is that language assessment is actually wrongly focused on judging against a stable variety at all. Okay, whether that stable variety is Singapore English, or Hong Kong English, or British English, or Australian English, which is what I speak. Okay, so we shouldn't be assessing against a stable variety because that's actually kind of misguided. And this is actually nicely summed up by Jennifer Jenkins and Constance Leung. And they're talking about, in this paper, I think it's a book chapter actually, they're talking about language assessment in English as a lingua franca. And they say the use of ELF involves speakers from diverse linguocultural backgrounds. They are not necessarily oriented towards a particular variety of English, native or otherwise. They use ELF to communicate with one another, to get things done, and to socialise. Therefore, this is the important bit, it's in blue, therefore the language assessment issues raised by ELF transcend questions of proficiency, conceptualised in terms of a stable variety. Okay? They are concerned with what counts as effective and successful communicative outcomes through the use of English. Okay? That can include emergent and innovative forms of language of pragmatic meaning. I mean, this actually sounds very interesting and exciting, but for those of us in language testing, it's actually a really radical critique. And it's not a critique that's necessarily easy to address, which is what I'll be talking about in the rest of the talk. But we see a similar kind of critique leveled from others. So again, Suresh Kanagaraja has made a similar type of appeal, saying that there's a need to fundamentally reconfigure our understanding of language proficiency itself. And what he says is that we need to look at these kind of capabilities or capacities, like the capacity to negotiate diverse varieties. Okay, just looking at the highlighted bits here, we need to look at negotiation skills such as speech accommodation, proficiency in pragmatics, dialect differentiation, code switching, style shifting, interpersonal communication, conversation management, and discourse strategies. Now, some of our language tests do this kind of stuff already. They do actually do this stuff. And we'll have a look at an example of that. But I think, again, these are really interesting ideas for language testers and language assessment people to be working with. So, if we think kind of to summarise here at this stage, this ELF challenge for language testing represents, as I said before, a kind of radical shift away from more traditional models of communicative competence, okay? And this is where the second language acquisition folks might be interested here, because a lot of what we do and a lot of our practices in language testing and in second language acquisition are very much rooted in this kind of Canale and Swain version of communicative competence, okay? But in ELF, this fluid nature of communicative interaction is heavily foregrounded. So in some of these more traditional views of communicative competence, the fluid and dynamic nature of communication is sort of there on the edges, okay? But what's really of importance is this kind of core linguistic knowledge and performance skill. ELF kind of, reverses that and places the uncertainty at the center. Okay. So the focus turns to things like linguistic repertoires, communicative strategies required to function in a dynamic environment. And so I think the basic way of explaining it is that it shifts from a view of a fixed ability, fixed proficiency, to highlighting adaptability of repertoires and what somebody can do in different environments. Okay, so we know that's the critique, okay? What has the response been from the field, from language testers and language assessors? Actually, there has been a considerable amount of engagement with ELF in the field of language testing and assessment, and I think it's been well covered in a lot of conceptual papers. So there's actually a whole range of different people who've had perspectives on the challenge of ELF in different ways, and some of those are listed there. And in looking at those papers, quite often, not always, but quite often, the field has kind of defended itself against these critiques. And I would say there have been three types of defense against the challenge of ELF. The first one is that language assessment researchers do actually conduct ELF-related research, and we'll have a look at that shortly. The second is that assessments are already shifting towards ELF communicative skills. Have a look at that as well. And the third is that language testers actually need to manage a lot of different constraints. And we'll look at that too. So let's start with the first one, which is that language assessment researchers are conducting a lot of ELF-related research. This is kind of true, okay? If you look at a lot of particularly more recent language assessment research, you can see at least three different types of research themes where people are actually really actively trying to respond to these challenges from ELF. So you've got several studies looking at L2 users as raters. So we say L2 users. A lot of testing organizations still want to only employ raters who are native speakers of English or a language. I think that's gradually shifting quite a lot, but it has required research to be able to shift the field. And that research has been done looking at raters of writing, looking at raters of speaking, and found that actually it's quite fine in most cases. An area where I actually did my PhD research some time back now was looking at the role of different accents in listening assessment. Okay, so how do sort of diverse range of accents affect listening comprehension, and how can we make it a kind of validity argument, justification for the use of different varieties, and I'll talk about that a bit later in the talk as well. And also this kind of shift in prioritising intelligibility in pronunciation assessment. This is another area that I'm kind of interested in. This idea that we've actually shifted in a lot of rating scales, for example, rubrics for pronunciation. It used to be that the native-like pronunciation was right at the top, okay? And we've seen that that has actually shifted in many cases towards an intelligible pronunciation, right? But it's a long battle, actually, and that's still not the case for all scales everywhere. But these are areas where language testing researchers have kind of actively tried to engage with some of these issues. So I think that's kind of something that we can be happy about. What about this claim that there's been a shift towards ELF communication in test design itself? Probably the best example of this is in paired speaking assessments. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with, for example, the Cambridge range of assessments, like first certificate in English and so on. These assessments typically have speaking tests where there are 2 candidates and 1 examiner, and at least one of the tasks requires those 2 candidates to talk to each other and to do some kind of task. Okay. Now that by nature is probably an ELF situation, okay, because the candidates don't get to choose who they're talking to, and it may be someone from a different linguistic background to them. So we have this kind of communicative scenario, and in these kind of paired speaking activities, test takers may need to do things like negotiate meaning, deal with speech variability, accommodate, repair if there's a breakdown in communication. So all of these things actually become quite integral. But actual kind of ELF strategies, say deep ELF strategies, may not be activated if there's no complication introduced. Okay, so it may actually be just a really smooth conversation. Nothing needs to be resolved linguistically. Okay. The other thing is that the rating scales. I say rating scales. I know here in the US it's rubrics, right? So this is I'm adapting. Okay, I'm accommodating. Rating scales, rubrics, may still focus on these more traditional communicative competencies. So let me just show you. This is the rubric for one of those Cambridge tests that I was talking about. There's actually nothing in here that's necessarily ELF related. What we do see here is a criterion for interactive communication, but it's really all about managing discourse effectively towards a common goal. Okay. So we've got other things here, like, for example, discourse management. Number 5, so top of the scale, produces extended stretches of language with very little hesitation. Okay, or contributions are relevant. There's clear organisation of ideas. Blah blah blah. These issues like hesitation and, as I said before, repetition are often penalised at higher levels of scales, when in fact what we know from Elfa Research is that they're often crucial for that negotiation of meaning. So what we see here is a scale that may be at odds with what's really trying to be achieved. So that's that critique. Now the third one, as I said, was that language testers actually have to manage a lot of different competing constraints. Now here's language assessment, language testing, and there's kind of 2 different forces. Now Meg would probably say there's more than 2 different forces, right? There's so many different forces, but this is a simplification, okay? Oops. Oh, okay, that hasn't worked properly. I don't know why.
It's not adapting.
No, it's not adapting. Do you know? There we go. That's, I wonder why that happened. Okay. So on the one side, language assessment is feeding on ideas, that sounds a little bit like It's not what we are, is it? No, it's taking ideas from applied linguistics. It's deriving models and constructs from, this field of language. On the other side, it also has the pressures of measurement, okay? And those pressures from measurement, like stability, okay? Test takers want to know what to expect. They don't want to have surprises, okay? Reliability, very important. And one of the things which makes ELF very challenging is if we're thinking about kind of unpredictable scenarios changing from time to time. This is like, language testers don't want that because it disrupts things. Fairness, which is a very legitimate concern. So coming back to that idea of different accents in listening assessment, one of the big concerns there is that if you're a test taker and you're hearing a range of different accents, and you hear your own accent, okay, not your own accent, but an accent that you're very familiar with, then you may be advantaged compared to somebody else taking the same test, okay? So that's a legitimate concern for fairness and absence of bias. And then also acceptability. Test takers may not be ready for these kinds of changes, okay? They may not be willing to kind of buy into a kind of more, what we might see as a more progressive outlook on language testing. So all of these constraints are very, very much real and in the minds of test developers and test designers, which is partly why I think people view the field of language testing and assessment as somewhat conservative, in this kind of small c conservative, just, taking a long time to make change and to progress. But it's because of these very, very challenging measurement issues which need to be dealt with. Okay. A final kind of issue here, which is one that's not often raised, but when we see critiques from ELF perspective, there's also this issue, are we actually just raising the bar? The kinds of skills and competences we're thinking about here are actually very challenging. Okay? They're not things that everybody can do, and they may not necessarily be things that everybody can learn to do well. But, so we have to also consider, a test is a hurdle that often is required to be achieved in order to go on and do something else. So are we actually talking here about making things harder and more challenging and more difficult? So this is something we have to keep in mind as well. But I think, and maybe you would agree, that if we are to think about test purpose, okay, the purpose for assessment, why are we testing? Why are we delivering a language test? In many, many situations, these kinds of ELF competences, as I might call them, are extremely real, okay? So ELF communication is a clear feature, particularly of many specific purpose domains. So we talked about some of these earlier, aviation, okay? And there's research to support each of these, okay? Diplomacy and international relations, okay? There's, in the Asia-Pacific region, there's an organization called ASEAN, which is, the Asia-Pacific countries, and their international language of diplomacy is English, okay? Really kind of, again, classic ELF kind of context. Business communication, call center communication, it's another big one. English for academic purposes, health communication, and so on. So, if we think about all of these different scenarios, different contexts, there is a kind of imperative to at least consider and to extend our thinking about, okay, if we want to develop a test that taps into these ELF competences, what would it look like? Okay? What kind of shape would it have? What kinds of priorities would it have? So, in our chapter Tim and I kind of sketch out what we see as a kind of basic ELF construct, okay? And if you're not sure, in language testing we often talk about the construct as the ability that we're measuring, okay? So what would an ELF construct look like? Well, it would focus on the ability to tolerate and comprehend different varieties of English, okay? Different accents, different syntactic forms, different discourse styles. So it would necessarily have to include that. It would have to tap into an ability to negotiate meaning, okay, when there's sort of ambiguous meaning. It would have to look at the ability to essentially to accommodate, okay, to use phonological features which are crucial for intelligibility across speakers of different L1 backgrounds. It would have to show or to tap into an awareness of appropriate cross-cultural pragmatics, and to be kind of rapidly aware of politeness in cross-cultural situations. It would need to essentially tap into your ability to make yourself understandable in a kind of broader sense to whoever you're speaking with. And you would also have to be able to notice and to repair breakdowns in communication. There's a lot of things, actually. They're not all necessarily easy to do. How would we go about assessing these things? Right. So there's kind of two approaches, I think. The first approach is that we might, as I say, kind of drop in ELF competences within existing approaches to language proficiency assessment, so that we might kind of enhance existing approaches to assessment by trying to, I guess, just draw out some of the ELFness. Okay, I'll show you an example in a minute. The other one is that we would just design these purpose-built ELF assessment tasks. So I'm going to show you an example of each one. In each case, what I'm going to show you is very, very kind of small scale and exploratory. I've started just kind of piloting different ideas, and it'll be interesting actually to see your feedback on these as well. So the first one I'm going to focus on is just specifically trying to target this idea of the ability to comprehend different varieties of English, different accents in particular. Okay, so this is a study that I did, as I said, a very small scale study, which is reported in a chapter in a new book. If you're interested in listening assessment, there's a new book by Elvis Wagner and Karaoke, which has just been released about a month ago, called Emerging Issues in the Assessment of Second Language Listening. And there's a whole section of that book on accents and listening assessment. And in this particular study, my rationale, kind of what I was trying to do here was, okay, so starting from this kind of perspective, in ELF context, comprehending or adapting to an unfamiliar accent is of principal importance to communicative success. Okay, we understand that. If it's a kind of monologic, non-interactive context, like a lot of listening tests are, there's no recourse for requesting clarification, checking your understanding and so on. And we know that listening to an unfamiliar accent in a non-interactive context can increase listening difficulty. Okay, so far clear. But we don't necessarily know what test takers do when they engage with an unfamiliar accent during a listening test. So we kind of know that it's more difficult for them. But I was sort of interested in finding out a bit more about their kind of experience throughout the listening test of dealing with an unfamiliar accent and what kinds of listening behaviours they were doing. So essentially the aim was considering to what extent would an unfamiliar accent actually modify the listening construct by triggering any specific types of listening behaviour, strategic behaviour, adaptive behaviour. Okay. And so the way I looked at this was I just did a study with a small group of speakers who were all L1 speakers of French. Now the important thing here was I screened all these listeners, these 6 listeners, to make sure I wanted to find an accent that they had absolutely no familiarity with at all. Okay, and they all reported no familiarity at all with a Thai English accent. Okay, so they heard listening tests spoken in a Thai English accent and also in a standard Southern British English accent. The reason for that is not to suggest that one is sort of naturally more intelligible, but these listeners were highly familiar with standard Southern British English just from their coursework and so on. So they completed these listening tests, and while they were doing it, I was not necessarily interested in their scores. What I was interested in was what they were thinking and doing while they were listening. Okay, so there was sort of 3 parts to what they did. As they were listening and answering questions, I asked them to do a retrospective verbal report on their item response. Okay, then I asked them to do a stimulated recall procedure after they listened, because I wanted to find out just where they had difficulty during the listening process itself. And then finally I did a kind of post hoc interview. And in analysing the data, I was particularly interested in just sort of pulling out these instances where they oriented in some way towards the speaker's pronunciation, the speaker's accent, some kind of intelligibility related episode. Okay. So this is kind of just to show you an overview of what came out of it. The interesting thing here is that this is from the retrospective verbal reports, and this is the stimulated recall. In each case, these are all the instances, sort of frequency counts of instances where they oriented in some way towards the speaker's accent. So the interesting thing here is obviously that there was very little orientation towards the standard Southern British English speaker's accent in any way. It was just sort of normalised for them. When they heard the Thai English speaker, there were more comments, but you can see a lot of variation. Okay, quite considerable kind of individual variation just across these 6 speakers. And in fact, that ranged from someone like Victor, who was really struggling, to Emma, who kind of said, oh, didn't notice, had no idea. So that was kind of an interesting starting point. The main sources of difficulty that they reported were of kind of 3 kinds. General intelligibility, so Victor here said, to be honest, I didn't get a lot of things. I think some of the words were like cut or compressed. I don't know. Maybe it's the accent that it was really hard for me to understand. This happened right at the beginning of the test after he answered the first question. Okay. Word recognition and segmentation. Another listener said, yeah, there's a word I cannot get, tivistry. Okay, what did you hear? I heard tivistry, but it doesn't make sense. Okay, but in the Thai accent, there's actually sort of characteristic lack of reduction of vowels. Okay, so he probably said more, and also sort of th stopping. So he would have said something more like T history, something like that, which kind of threw off this listener again, fairly early in the piece. And then actually some listeners reported more of a kind of just a distraction or wrong footing. Okay, so not necessarily a kind of comprehension problem, but a sort of attentional problem. Where they said the accent's different from what I'm used to hearing, so I hear things, but I'm not sure if he's really saying what I'm hearing, so I'm confused. So had difficulties to stay focused and understand. And this is, so I know Nick actually has done some research in this area of attitudinal responses to to listening, and that is absolutely, I think, a part of this, a part of what we're seeing here. But what was interesting was all of those listeners who reported difficulty also reported quite deliberate strategic behaviour, okay? So directed attention, so Pitt said I would say I focused more for the Thai English accent because I knew it would be harder to understand because of the accent, especially from the second part onwards. I didn't know the voice yet, right? And selective attention, so directed attention is kind of just generally saying I'm just going to concentrate more, okay? Selective attention is actually saying I'm going to concentrate on some specific things that I know are going to be important. And I should say again for the SLA people, if you're interested, this kind of framework comes from Christine Go and Van de Grift, kind of metacognitive strategies for listening. Okay, so selective attention, so Victor said, second one, it was a lot harder, so I just had to focus on keywords. And when I had them, then I tried to remember the previous sentence, okay, with the keywords, and then I tried to find out the answer for the questions. Okay, so this person was really just focusing on keywords and comprehension monitoring, which is a kind of metacognitive strategy where you just kind of keep saying, am I understanding this right? Have I got this right? So in this case, Martin was saying, I always have to think about what he just said and just check if it's similar to an English word I know, or something like that. So there was a lot of strategic work happening during the listening test, okay? What was really interesting was there were reports from these listeners that they just adapted within the listening test, okay? So Lola, for example, said the first part was more difficult to understand, but afterwards I got used to it. When the first part, when he started to talk about friendship, it was the most difficult to understand. And Martin here saying, okay, for part 2 I understood more because I just got used to the accent, so it's okay. All right. The first part of the listening test was around 2 minutes long, okay? So this actually kind of confirms some of the psycholinguistic research, which is typically done actually on L1 listeners, which shows that people can rapidly adapt to an unfamiliar accent in a fairly short space of time. So some conclusions from this small study, okay? A listener's ability to deal with an unfamiliar accent cannot be considered static, okay? I think this is actually really important because when we say, oh, we're going to give a listening test in a particular accent, we say, oh no, that would be too hard. Well, no, there's stuff happening within the listening test. There's learning happening, perceptual adaptation, and I think this is actually really important to consider. Most listeners appear to be working hard to overcome their initial perceptual problems, so demonstrating an orientation towards what we might call receptive accommodation. Now, this is a term that is often used in ELF literature, but usually is used in terms of sort of interactive speaking context where people are using requests for clarification and so on. Here I think that receptive accommodation is purely kind of cognitive and strategic because there's actually no chance to ask questions for clarification, but we can see it happening anyway. So in my paper I called it a concerted effort to adjust one's listening behaviour in order to understand an unfamiliar interlocutor. And I think we can actually see here that the introduction of an unfamiliar, I should say, accent has a tangible effect on the listening construct. So actually that initial aim does introduce an unfamiliar accent change the listening construct. Yes, it does. We can see more strategic behaviour, more different sources of difficulty and so on. So then the question for testers is that something I want to model in my task? Is that something that's important for me to be able to predict some kind of future communicative behaviour? And I would argue, yes, it is, actually. But you know, it's not an easy thing to actually design. Okay, I don't have too much time left, but I will show you the second approach. Now you remember the second approach was to kind of build a purpose-built ELF task. And this is the thing that I'm kind of trying to think about at the moment and really figure out where it goes next. But essentially, this kind of task would try and capture all of these competences in just one task. That would be amazing, right? I thought about how to do this, and what I ended up coming up with was, right, there's certain characteristics that an ELF task would need to have. So firstly, it would need to be interactive, right? Has to be interactive. And it has to be goal-oriented, because otherwise the interlocutors will just, the kind of let it pass principle. No one's going to engage in difficult conversation unless they really need to achieve something. Okay, so it needs to be interactive, needs to be goal-oriented. It needs to elicit negotiation of both form and meaning, ideally. And breakdowns in communication need to be anticipated in some way. So we really need tasks where meaning has to be co-constructed by interlocutors and where complications are built in to the task itself. There would need to be rating criteria which prioritize and reward the kinds of linguistic and strategic behaviors we're interested in ELF communication. And setup, ideally interlocutors would not know each other, okay? And ideally interlocutors would have kind of little familiarity with each other's L1. So we're creating here quite a challenging task. What I turned to was these. Some of you will be familiar with this. I was just sort of interested in piloting these as a kind of ELF task. So this is from the HCRC corpus of map tasks. These are all freely available on the web. And these map tasks are used as quite useful activities for measuring kind of communicative effectiveness. What's interesting about them? So you have two maps. One's for an information receiver and one's for an information provider. So the information provider has to say, right, start at point X, go left, then go around, go up. And the information receiver has to try and draw this route on his or her own map. But it's not as simple as that, because it involves complications. So each map might have different features, absent or present. Some of the features might have different names, and some features may be kind of doubled up or moved around into different areas. So the idea there is that we know there's going to be some kind of breakdown in communication, at least saying, but I don't have that, what are you talking about? But you can also label these features to anticipate, for example, phonological difficulties. So you might want to target specific features of English phonology that interactors might find challenging to produce, which will then require accommodation from their listener or request for clarification and so on. So these tasks seem kind of interesting to explore. So I sort of piloted these tasks, and I'm going to show you just some data from one of these where the information provider was May, who was a Thai L1 speaker, and the information receiver was Ricardo, who was a Spanish L1 speaker. And I gave them maps, and these maps had certain things that had been changed around, kind of semi-deliberately, in order to try and maximize this kind of potential. It was quite cruel, really. I did have ethics approval for it, but just to try and make this a little bit interesting. So they went through this, and this was Ricardo's response. So you can see on the left, this was the map that May had as the information provider, and this was Ricardo's map that he drew after their. What do you think? Do you think he did a good job? Or do you think May did a good job? Whose performance is it? Yeah, I think they did a pretty good job, right? One of the really interesting things about these map tasks is you can get a kind of objective view of the accuracy, I guess, of the route. you can actually sort of put grid lines over here and say how far away from the original route it is. And that's something that's kind of interesting to explore. Okay, yeah, I think they did a pretty good job. There are a few bits where things went wrong, particularly kind of towards the end. What I was more interested in was what was happening at the discourse level. So you can see here, for example, just a transcript from their interaction. So May saying, and from Saxon Barn, go down the hill again and you see pelicans. And then pause. Pelicans? Where are the pelicans? Pelicans is on your right hand, on my right. And then, you know, he actually kind of got it. Now what's interesting, I think, just from even this short excerpt is this is not on face value what you would say is a smooth and fluent performance, right? On that FCE scale that we saw earlier, this may not actually get either person a very high mark. You know, there's long pauses. I mean, 1.6 seconds is quite a long pause, okay? There's, you know, repetition. This repetition actually serves quite a useful purpose. We've got pelicans, 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 your right hand, on my right. Okay, so we've got repetition, we've got hesitation, but it's all deployed in a way that actually makes this a kind of successful communication. So some observations from that task were the task should be both complex enough, okay, to elicit requested behaviour, but I think in the case of this particular task, there's kind of an overemphasis on specific functions, so giving directions. So the ideal solution, and this is where I'm working now with our research group at Lancaster University, is to kind of come up with some similar tasks, not similar tasks, but tasks based on the same design principles. So for example, goal-oriented, information gap, complications built in, and so on. But which actually have more authenticity for a specific purpose. So for example, an academic discussion task. And that's kind of taking up some of our thinking time at the moment. One of the big challenges is if you want to truly gauge adaptability, you really need to observe people over multiple tasks, multiple interlocutors, and then, you know, it gets a little bit unwieldy. But some outstanding issues as well. What would be included on the rating scale? Okay, should the scale be analytic or holistic? What a rate is able to realistically observe in practice? This is actually a really big one. I mean, if you think about that discourse level analysis, raters can't tune in at that level. Okay, so what are we going to do about that? I'm just going to skip these slides because I need to finish, and they were just a little bit more elaboration. But what I do want to say is that challenges in designing ELF assessments are significant, okay? But I think actually they're quite exciting for those of us who like to kind of think about new ways of doing things. And there's a lot of areas for new research in this kind of field. And future research would look into task design, which is what we're doing, task design for eliciting ELF competences, rating scale development and use, okay? There's a lot to do there. Rater training, which I think will be quite interesting. You know, raters, as we know from literature, raters internalise scales. Probably there's a lot of raters who've internalized, archetypal scale. And lots of training is probably not going to shift that scale out of their minds, okay? But how do we deal with that if we want to have a kind of quite radically different construct? And also some of these issues around individual differences in ELF competences. So what other kinds of cognitive skills are involved? And, you know, there is some research on perceptual adaptation, which says, you know, working memory, executive function, all these things are actually really crucial. And for people who have an interest in the more kind of cognitive side of things, that could be quite interesting. So, that's it for me. And, yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Of course, I'll ask the question.
Okay. Hi.
Hi, I'm Alex.
Hi, Alex.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk today. It was really enlightening for me because through your use of through your talk, I realized that for quite a while, for the past 5 to 10 years, I've been teaching ELF in the corporate world as part of modules to train employees of large multinational companies who have to engage in these kinds of, lingua franca based interactions in order to get tasks done.
Okay.
And there's such a need for that kind of training and assessment, like you're talking about, so that they can accomplish their jobs. And so what I found very useful in both the training and the assessment of these kind of competencies was drawing from the field of intercultural communication, where there's so many types of these sort of information gap tasks that we've always used in ESL teaching and training, and they're geared to be very adaptable to different groups of people, like you're saying. I mean, you have to be able to adapt these tasks so that they're as real world oriented as possible.
Yes.
So I take these tasks and I apply them to the world of agricultural biotechnology, and come up with tasks that have information gap and require also the interactants to change styles, like from direct and indirect speech, and that gets at the idea of politeness and whose politeness strategies you use.
It'd be great to hear about some of your tasks or see some of your tasks.
I'd be happy to, and thank you so much for bringing up this this title, because I left the field of applied linguistics in the mid-late 90s.
Right.
So I'm really fossilized in amber when it comes to the terms that were used at that point, and I was trained by the Kachus, who were so instrumental in world Englishes. So I really love this concept of lingua franca and how we can apply that in these real world situations that require it.
Yeah, great, thanks. I would like to, maybe I can get in touch about those tasks. Thank you. Yes.
I was really interested in what you were just saying last about the individual differences research, because when you were doing the French speakers with the Thai, and you saw the differences in that they were engaging in reflective strategies, and as a native English speaker that watched all seasons of Peaky Blinders with the subtitles on, I did also wonder how strategy development and maybe those individual differences kind of interact with the strategies that native speakers would also employ to be understanding other accents, and how much of it is really ELF-specific strategies,
I don't think. I mean, that's a great point. I don't think they're necessarily ELF-specific strategies. I think that when we're thinking about listeners with different proficiency levels, there's a little bit more going on, because obviously the kind of cognitive demands of processing the speech may already be. So those French listeners were around. I don't know, what's a good is CFR common currency here?
What CFR level are you thinking of?
B2.
So like intermediate.
Upper intermediate. So they were pretty strong, and I think. They were. I would say they were expert listeners, and what was interesting is, for the ones who were affected, it almost kind of sort of sent them back to a sort of lower proficiency level just for a little bit, while they were just dealing with everything, and then they kind of got back. But I think the cognitive individual difference variables actually could be really fascinating for someone to look at. Because, I've looked into this literature, and there is quite a lot on just speech adaptation, and as I said, usually it's among L1 listeners, and there are some very interesting findings. Another one is theory of mind, so there's lots of interesting stuff that I think can be done in that space for anyone who's looking for a dissertation topic or future PhD topic. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. So I think for your presentation, you have mostly focused on the speaking and listening. So I just wonder if there's any efforts in reading and writing, because that's a more stable construct, and how does that challenge, like, different from the traditional definition?
It's a really good question. Yeah, I partly focus on this just because it's my interests anyway, apart from it. I think that there has been some interest in writing in particular. You know, one of the kind of interesting questions is particularly around academic writing and how we deal with, as Meg said at the start, I'm a journal editor, right? And so I've got this elf hat on. And then, you know, you get a paper, a manuscript from somewhere, you think, okay, I might want to advise some corrections here. Oh no, am I, like, you know, bringing all my kind of hegemonic norms down to even a journal like World English's, you know, applies some kind of standard somewhere. I think those are really interesting questions, because as you say, the written code is somewhat more stable, or at least, I mean, I guess the thing with writing and reading is we have disciplinary conventions, if you like, and, you know, sort of academic genre requires a particular type of writing, whereas, you know, we can all, there's a lot more variability in our speaking, even in an academic genre. I think that's a very good answer to your question. I think the answer actually is I haven't thought about it enough. But did you want to say something?
Well, actually,
yeah.
I mean, I just finished reading 27 undergraduate papers where they were interviewing someone who came to this country after the age of 10.
Yeah.
And a lot of them focused, with the younger learners, they focused on the difficulty of texting, which is not necessarily academic writing, but in some cases it is academic communication. I mean, I often text Alison Mackey and then she writes me an email. Like, it's academic communication where, what the heck are we going to do about Luke's schedule? And then I get, dear Luke, Georgia, you know, when are you going to be there? And you know, we think about academic writing as a very stable environment, but there's other forms of communication that influence academic writing.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You know, ACTFL, all these years ago when we came up with the modalities, there was no such thing as interpersonal writing. But now there is.
Right, yeah.
But I have another point for you, which is, I don't think this is just about proficiency assessment, it's about performance assessment. You know, you need a certain level of proficiency is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Because when it comes to flying, I really don't care how proficient my pilot is. I want him to be able to communicate with ground control. Right. And I want them both to have this interaction.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think you're right. I mean, this is definitely firmly in the kind of performance assessment field.
But I think it's in both. Like, you have to have a certain level of proficiency in order to make it to the performance test.
Yes.
Like interpretation.
Yeah. You have to have, there's a kind of threshold level, I think. And and I don't think, well, there may be some more kind of radical Elfas who might dispute that, but I don't think there's I don't think there's much of an argument against that. It's just, where is that line, and then, you know, at what point do we go beyond that? Yes.
Oh, thank you, Luke. Very interesting talk. Interesting to see. Clearly, we have quite a bit in common.
Yeah.
I was actually wondering. So you pose some of the challenges that ELF brings to language testing. I'm actually, and maybe this is just a very different way of thinking about language testing. I myself work in policy and things like that. So I'm actually thinking the biggest challenge for me is actually not the internal validity of the tests themselves, but the testing practices, such as, so you mentioned the TOEIC, for example, or let's take TOEFL or IELTS or whatever in terms of like university admissions. To me, ELF and other proposals around ELF, so Conagarage's work, Pennycook, et cetera, one of the biggest challenges that they present is whose language we should be assessing at all. So should we ask our international students to take the TOEFL, or should we ask everyone to take the TOEFL?
I'm glad that you raised that, actually. I mean, that was one of the other points that we made in our chapter, and I think we're kind of, particularly in academic settings, we're kind of at this, in this area where we could go in two directions. But I think if we're going to go in an Elf direction, then we definitely have to be open to the consideration of we need to be assessing everyone for performance, in this future domain. Now that already happens in some context. So with Elf, you always go back to the aviation issue, but in aviation settings, even Australian or British, American pilots have to meet these requirements. Now, what's interesting, or you might be interested from the policy perspective, is that in practice, when those pilots or air traffic controllers turn up to the test centre, they just get a 2-minute interview and they tick scale number 6. Doesn't happen with every organisation, but many aviation tests will do that, because well, you're a native speaker, no problem, you're through, and that really runs counter to, in fact, the whole kind of purpose of that testing. So I think what you're saying is absolutely true, and we could be shifting this discussion more towards assessing for, just to check that everyone has this kind of skills that they require to enter some domain. But there's huge kind of policy implications. There's also, it's a political question, right? It's a very interesting one.
For most.
Yeah. So, and I think I would certainly support that kind of idea, but I think we'd have to have very strong kind of validity arguments for these tests to be able to say, well, this is, this is the barrier you need to cross, And then there's always the question of, do we need to test at all? This is the, and as I go back to that, are we just raising the bar for groups of people? But I think I'm convinced enough that these kinds of skills are actually quite crucial.
Well, and if I could just add to that,
and people who need to go, it's quarter till, but
please do.
they'll probably stay and argue for a bit.
I'm going to have to go too here, but I think that someone like you, who is an expert in language testing, saying those things is part of the political movement toward actually getting more equitable policies.
Yeah.
So I think that you have that responsibility. I'm not saying that you're eschewing it or anything. I'm just saying, I think it's part of. I think that your work is part of that.
Okay. Yeah. I think that thinking is happening, and there's definitely groundswell. But there's different views on where it should go. Whether people who just think everyone needs to be screened for academic literacy, or this kind of more Elf style competence. So
Thank you very much.
Okay. Oh yes.
Just to piggyback on that, I'm interested in these days of ITAs, International Teaching Assistants, myself.
All right.
So we have to take additional, a lot of tests. We have to pay for them. Not only do we pay for them, we go through them, and it's just I had at least 5 extra tests in other universities just because I was an ITA compared to my domestic TA. But then what we find is that because I had so many years of teaching experience, I didn't have any problems in the classroom and everything, although I took a lot of tests. But then a lot of domestic TAs, they didn't even have to get any experience whatsoever. And then we had these ITA tests, and they didn't know what to do with me. In a bunch of American institutions, they're like, okay, are we gonna test Aishinar? What are we gonna do with her? Because if we don't test, then we are we're doomed, because we have to test everyone because this is BLF. But then there were a lot of TAs. I was teaching them how to be a good communicator in class, they were American. This happens. So not every TA is amazing just because they're born in this country.
Absolutely.
I think we need to look at the way as a tool way, communication is co-constructed, right? And I'm sure you know Kim Khan's work. If you don't want to understand, you're not going to understand me. It has nothing to do with my accent.
No,
so I think
agree
we
with
need to look at the L1-based assessment as well, just like you said.
There's definitely
But this is a great direction, I think, for us.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was really